Hi everyone, this week I have a new compilation of 4 truly horrific teenage killers. It's a long video, so please enjoy and click like and subscribe. Thanks very much, and now on with the first case. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be going back to 2006 and visiting Medicine Hat, a city in southeast Alberta in Canada. With over 300 days of sunshine a year, Medicine Hat is thought to be the sunniest city in Canada, and back in 2006 had a population of around 57,000. With beautiful, picturesque landscapes, low cost of living, good schools, and a relatively low crime rate, Medicine Hat is generally viewed as a great place to live. So, in September of 2003, Deborah and Mark Richardson moved into their dream home in Cameron Road, a quiet suburban street in Medicine Hat. The couple, who married in 1991, had 2 children, a daughter named Jasmine and a son named Jacob, who were 9 and 5 respectively at the time of the move. The family settled into their new neighbourhood well, making friends with their neighbours. Deborah and Mark were happily married and shared a love of motorcycles. Mark was a talented mechanic and welder, was easygoing and had lots of friends. Deborah was a popular, bubbly woman. In 2006, Deborah had signed up for a course on small businesses and was hoping to start her own business after spending the previous few years being a stay-at-home mum. Now 12, Jasmine attended St Mary's School, where she was a happy, sociable and bright student. Her younger brother Jason, now 8 years old, loved wrestling figures and Star Wars, and he wanted to be a policeman or a soldier when he grew up. He was often seen by neighbours playing hockey in his back garden before walking the short distance to school. Sunday the 23rd of April 2006 was a bright, sunny day. The Richardsons' neighbour pulled onto her driveway and saw Mark's van parked outside his house. The neighbour's 6-year-old son asked if he could go and knock for his friend, Jacob Richardson, to which his mother agreed. Almost immediately, the young child ran back to his mother in a distressed state. He told her that he could see a body covered in blood through the basement window. The mother went to check, looked in the window, and hurried back to her car to call the police. Soon after, Inspector Brent Secondiak arrived at the house. Looking through the basement window, he saw a person covered in blood lying on the floor. Brent immediately called for backup, and when further officers arrived, they broke into the house using a battering ram, unsure of what they were going to find. The scene inside was shocking. On the lower floor of the house, they found the bodies of Deborah and Mark Richardson. They had both been stabbed multiple times. The family dog was sat next to Deborah's body, whimpering. There was a great deal of blood, including smears and handprints, in the hallway leading upstairs to the bedrooms. Here they came upon another devastating scene. Young Jacob's body was lying in a pool of blood on his bed. He had been stabbed multiple times and his throat had been slit. 2 15cm black-handled knives were found at the scene. One had been rinsed clean, whilst the other was still covered with dried blood and hair. One of the knives was bent at the tip, indicating the force with which it had been used. Immediately, the police realised that one of the family was missing. They began searching for 12-year-old Jasmine, fearing the worst. They expected to find another body. When this did not happen, they became concerned that Jasmine was being held captive by the person who murdered her family. An Amber Alert was issued. However, after an initial search of the house, including Jasmine's online accounts, it quickly transpired that it was very unlikely that she was a victim. In fact, this 12-year-old girl was their prime suspect. During the preceding few months, Jasmine had undergone a dramatic change. Almost overnight, she went from a young girl playing forts in the garden to someone who fully embraced what the newspapers called the local goth culture. She began wearing heavy, gothic-style dark makeup and looked far older than her 12 years. She had started getting into trouble at school for the first time, particularly in relation to her inappropriate clothing. Jasmine had joined various online forums under screen names such as Runaway Devil, where she discussed her love of piercings, dark poetry and death metal music, and also her hatred of her parents. At a rock concert, she had met a man by the name of Jeremy Steinke. Jeremy, who was 23 years old at the time, claimed that he was actually a werewolf who had lived for over 300 years. Jeremy had a difficult upbringing. His father had beat him most days, and his mother turned to alcohol in an attempt to cope with her situation. When his parents divorced, things did not improve. 2 stepfathers followed, both of whom were violent towards Jeremy and his mother. Likely because of this, at around the age of 13, Jeremy developed an alternative persona of being a werewolf. As he reached adulthood, his friends knew that he liked the taste of blood, and he would wear a vial of blood around his neck. A former flatmate would later say how he had witnessed Jeremy slicing his own hand with a knife in order to drink his own blood. Jeremy became a guitarist in a heavy metal band called Project Status Quo, and he would dress completely in black, usually ripped black jeans with pins, a bandana around his neck which could easily be pulled over his face, a spiked dog chain as a choker, black eyeliner, and his short hair styled into spikes. When Jeremy met Jasmine, he had just broken up with his fiancée and was reportedly in a very dark place. The two quickly became obsessed with each other. Understandably, Jasmine's parents were not happy with their daughter spending time with a man almost twice her age, and they told her that she was forbidden from seeing him. However, neither Jasmine or Jeremy were prepared to accept this, and soon their online communication began detailing a very dark plan. Jasmine wrote to Jeremy stating that she had a plan which begins with me killing them and ends with me living with you. To which Jeremy replied, "Well, I love your plan, but we need to get a little more creative with, details and stuff." Jasmine and Jeremy spoke openly with their friends about their hatred of her parents and how they planned to kill them. These friends did not believe that Jasmine and Jeremy were serious. They thought that the pair were just sounding off. On Friday the 21st of April, Jeremy was at a party where he boasted that soon he was going to kill 3 people and then head to Europe with his girlfriend. The following day, Saturday the 22nd, whilst Mark was cooking a barbecue on his back porch for his family, Jeremy was watching the 1994 film Natural Born Killers, a film that he would later claim was the best love story of all time. By the following morning, Deborah, Mark and Jacob had all been stabbed to death. That same afternoon, as her family's bodies were being found by the police, a seemingly relaxed and happy Jasmine and Jeremy were hanging out together with a group of friends. Jeremy had a black eye, but this wasn't an unusual occurrence for a man well known for trouble by the local police. At around 8 a.m. the following day, Monday the 24th of April, the pair were tracked down and arrested about 100 miles away in Leader, Saskatchewan. They were with 3 friends who claimed that they believed they were going on a camping trip together. Both Jasmine and Jeremy were charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Due to only being 12 years old at the time, Jasmine could not be named and was referred to in the press as JR, although it was clear to anyone reading the press coverage that she was the young daughter of the murdered family. In her first court appearance, Jasmine appeared shackled in an oversized blue jumpsuit. She did not speak other than to confirm her name, and suddenly this young girl who had presented herself as so much older looked like a 12-year-old child again. Because of the differences in their ages, Jasmine and Jeremy had to be tried separately. If convicted, the maximum sentence that Jasmine could receive would be 10 years, with no more than 6 of these being spent in custody, the remainder being served under supervision in the community, after which she would be free. However, Jeremy, if convicted, would face a life sentence without the possibility of parole for at least 25 years. After release, he would continue to be monitored for the rest of his life. During their time in jail awaiting trial, Jasmine and Jeremy exchanged letters where they promised to marry one day. They boasted about how they would become legends and expressed no guilt or remorse for their actions, just sadness that they hadn't managed to run away. Jasmine went to trial first, beginning on the 4th of June 2007. She pleaded not guilty, claiming that conversations about murdering her parents were hypothetical and that she never had any intention of acting upon them. The prosecution called around 70 witnesses, including several friends who provided details of how Jasmine was acting immediately after the murder. They also detailed how Jasmine had told them about her brother making a gurgling sound as he died. This was a fact that was backed up by the young boy's autopsy. The prosecution showed that 48-year-old Deborah had been killed first, having been stabbed 12 times. Her husband, Mark, rushed to her aid and attempted to defend himself with a screwdriver. He was overpowered and stabbed 24 times. Jacob had been strangled, stabbed, and then his throat was cut. The brutal, graphic nature of the crime came to light, with over 1,500 crime scene photographs being entered into evidence. Forensic evidence was presented linking Jasmine and Jeremy to the crime scene, including footprints found near the broken basement window, which were consistent with Jasmine's size 6 Converse and Jeremy's size 10.5 suede shoes. There was, however, so much blood in the basement of the house that investigators couldn't even attempt to take footwear impressions. On the 3rd of July 2007, Jasmine took the witness stand. She broke down in tears and said that she blamed herself for the murders because she had told Jeremy that she wished her family were dead, even though she did not mean it. She testified that she had tried to comfort her brother as they listened to their parents being killed and had retrieved a knife in order to protect herself. However, when Jeremy appeared and demanded that she stabbed her younger brother, she did so. She claims that Jeremy then grabbed the knife and slit her brother's throat. Despite testifying that she was scared of Jeremy, Jasmine said that she was shocked when he left the house without her. She ran to a nearby convenience store to get cash and then called a taxi to go and meet up with Jeremy. Details about Jeremy's claims of being a werewolf were not disclosed in court as they were deemed to be too inflammatory and not relevant to the case. Additionally, the initial police interview with Jasmine was not shown as it was stated that the police used subtle threats and manipulation to gain a statement and violated Jasmine's right to have a lawyer present. The jury of 7 men and 5 women deliberated for just over 3 hours before returning their verdict. Jasmine was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to the maximum of 6 years in prison plus 4 years supervision. It would take another 16 months for Jeremy's case to go to trial. It was moved to Calgary due to the intense publicity surrounding the murders. Again, witnesses testified that Jeremy and Jasmine had confessed to the crimes and that Jeremy had claimed his victims were gutted like fish. The jury were told how, after his arrest, Jeremy had confessed to the murders to an undercover police officer. He reportedly told the officer that, as he stabbed Mark, Mark had asked why, to which Jeremy replied, "Because your daughter wanted it that way." He told the officer that he had killed Deborah first, but then had killed Mark in self-defense, even expressing surprise that he had managed to overpower the larger man. Jeremy stated that it was Jasmine and not himself who had killed Jacob. In court, a friend of Jeremy's testified that when Jeremy had been watching Natural Born Killers the night before the murders, there was a scene where the younger brother was spared, to which Jeremy had said that's where it would be different, she would kill her brother. When Jeremy took the stand on the 1st of December 2008, despite the horrific nature of the crimes for which he was charged, he came across as a more sympathetic defendant than Jasmine had in her trial. Talk of his abusive childhood and desperate need to be loved led on to how he had been controlled by Jasmine, who he believed to be older than her 12 years. Jeremy admitted being out of control on alcohol, marijuana, cocaine and ecstasy on the night of the murders, but said that he had never intended to kill anyone. He was simply planning on helping Jasmine sneak out of her house so that they could be together. He recalled stabbing Deborah once in the abdomen and could recall the struggle with Mark, but said that he could not remember anything else. This was all in contradiction to his extensive online posts before the killings, his confessions to friends, and his confession to the undercover police officer, which Jeremy claimed was purely prison bravado so that other inmates would leave him alone. The one point on which he was consistent was that it was Jasmine who had killed Jacob. His lawyers claimed that the crimes were as a result of an impulsive reaction, not premeditated murder, so he could only be found guilty of second-degree murder or manslaughter. On the 4th of December 2008, the 6 women and 6 men of the jury retired to consider their verdict. The following day, Jeremy was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison and will be eligible for parole after 25 years. In 2012, the Canadian press reported that Jasmine was responding well to therapy and was showing significant and genuine remorse after finally taking responsibility for what she had done. By the following year, it was reported that she was living under supervision and doing well at work, school, was living on her own, and was a low risk of reoffending, almost becoming a poster child for rehabilitation. She was given a new identity, and following the completion of her sentence and supervision, she is now a completely free woman. As additional information, 2 other teenagers were arrested and charged with accessory to murder after the fact and obstruction of justice. It is believed that these teens helped destroy evidence and provide a false alibi, as well as driving Jasmine and Jeremy out of the province on the so-called camping trip. The accessory to murder charges were later dropped, with both of them pleading guilty to obstruction of justice. Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the horrific case of Barbara Olson, a 78-year-old great-grandmother who was brutally murdered for just $155. Barbara Jean Shipman, who more commonly went by Barb, was born on the 2nd of July 1934 in Eau Claire County, Wisconsin, to Mansell and Eunice Shipman. She grew up with 2 sisters, Sandy and Bee, and attended Bloomer High School in Wisconsin. She graduated in 1952 and married Wesley Olson on the 27th of February 1954. The couple had a long and happy marriage and had 3 children together, 2 daughters, Joy and Judy, and a son named Stephen. Barb retired in 1996 and enjoyed spending her time gardening, playing piano, crafting, watching the Green Bay Packers, and tracing her family heritage. She loved spending time with her large family, which by this time included 8 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. She was a volunteer driver, taking elderly people to and from their appointments, and she was also an active member of the local church. By 2012, Barb lived alone on West Ridge Drive in Sheboygan Falls. Her husband Wesley, by this time suffering with Alzheimer's, and was now living in a nursing home. Barb's daughter Judy lived just a few miles away, and Barb would often pop in to visit Judy of a morning. On Tuesday the 18th of September 2012, Barbara didn't visit her daughter. This wasn't necessarily a cause for alarm, but when Barb didn't visit the following day, Judy became concerned. She called and texted her mother, but got no reply. Judy decided to visit Barb's house and entered through the garage door. It was here that she found her mother lying on the ground covered in blood. Judy ran to the nearest neighbour's house and called the police. She returned with the neighbour and, too traumatised to go near her mother's body, the neighbour had to check to see if Barb was still breathing. The authorities pronounced that she was dead shortly afterwards. When Barb was found, she had a blanket covering her head. Under this, she had been beaten to such an extent that the top of her head was crushed and her face unrecognisable. There was a trail of blood from the house to the garage indicating that the attack had taken place inside Barb's home. At the autopsy, it was established that Barb had suffered at least 27 blows to her head, face and arms. A murder investigation was immediately underway. Barb was a kind, peaceful lady who had no enemies. Family members and neighbours were questioned and CCTV footage from the area was examined. This CCTV footage led the police to 2 13-year-old boys, Antonio Barbeau and Nathan Paape. They were both present at Barb's house at the time of her death. Antonio was Barb's great-grandson. Nathan was the first to be questioned by the police. He became hysterical during the interview and said that he could not say what he needed to in front of his mother. He asked for a piece of paper so that he could write down what happened, stating, "He killed his grandma and I was with him." Soon after, Antonio was interviewed. Whilst he was initially reluctant to answer any questions, he soon confessed to the crime and told the police his story of what had happened. On Friday the 14th of September 2012, Antonio ran away from social care and went to stay at Nathan's house. By the following Monday, he told Nathan that he knew where they could get their hands on some money. The 2 boys asked Nathan's mum to drive them to Sheboygan Falls under the pretense that they wanted to visit a friend. Instead, they made their way to Barb's house. Realising that the garage door was open, they crept inside. However, Barb heard a noise and went to the garage to see what was going on. When she saw her great-grandson and his friend, she asked them if they were in the garage because they were cold, and then invited them into her house. Knowing that Antonio had run away, Barb said that she needed to call his mother to let her know that he was safe. It was at that moment that Antonio attacked the 78-year-old woman, hitting her in the head with a hatchet. It is at this point that the two boys' versions of what happened began to differ. Antonio stated that after the first blow, he ran to the bathroom as he felt sick, and when he returned he saw Nathan beating Barb with a hammer. Contrastingly, Nathan claimed that he believed any talk of killing Barb was a joke, and that they were just going to scare her. He said that he witnessed Antonio beating Barb, and that he himself had only hit her twice when Antonio asked for help, because he feared the consequences if he hadn't. After Barb was dead, the two boys dragged her to the garage and tried to put Barb's body into the boot of her car. When they were unable to do this, they covered her head with a blanket and left her in the garage. Returning to the house, they wiped down all of the surfaces that they had touched before stealing her jewellery, credit card, $155, and some other items. They drove away in Barb's car, which they abandoned at a Sheboygan bowling alley. They left the keys in the ignition and many of the stolen items in view, in the hope that someone would steal the car and then be implicated as the murderer. After this, they went and ordered pizza at a nearby restaurant, using Barb's money to pay. The police would later find the murder weapons and a crocheted blanket that was covered in blood in the boot of the car. The two boys first appeared in court on Friday the 21st of September 2012, where it was confirmed that they were each charged as adults with first-degree intentional homicide and held on $1 million bail. Antonio claimed that he was not guilty of murder due to suffering from mental illness. Some 3 years earlier, when he was 10 years old, he was riding his bike when he was hit by a car. As a result, he had a traumatic brain injury that altered his personality and also prevented him from taking part in sports such as football and boxing. He was assessed, and whilst it was recognised that he had an unspecified cognitive disorder, he was deemed competent to stand trial. He later changed his plea to no contest as part of an agreement with the prosecutors. Nathan pled not guilty, and at trial Antonio testified against him. After just 2 hours, the jury found that he was guilty of first-degree intentional murder. Nathan was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 31 years. Antonio was convicted of first-degree intentional murder and was also sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 36 years. At the sentencing hearing, Antonio's grandmother, Barb's daughter, read a statement in which she said, "My mum was not a vindictive person. She would want Antonio to have a chance to be a better person, to have hope, to have something to work towards." Antonio tried to read an apologetic statement to the court, but was too distressed to do so. He passed it to his defence attorney, who had to fight back tears as he read it aloud. Antonio will be eligible for parole when he is 50 years old. Psst. New York is famous for its New Year's Eve ball drop. However, in Sheboygan County, they are known for their big cheese drop on New Year's Eve, as nearby Plymouth is officially the cheese capital of the world. Goodbye. For today's true crime narration, we shall be visiting Savona, which is a small village in Steuben County, New York. Savona has always been a small village. The population peaked in the 1990s at around 1,000 people and has been on a slight decline since that time. In 1993, when the crime we are looking at took place, the 900 or so people who lived there enjoyed living in a safe, small community where most people were known to one another. Children played out in the streets and doors were often left unlocked. Our narration today concentrates on two families who lived on opposite sides of this small village. The Roby family, 34-year-old printer Dale and his 27-year-old wife, Doreen, lived in the church rectory at Church and McCoy Streets with their 2 sons, Derek, who was born on the 2nd of October 1988, and Dalton, who was a couple of years younger. Derek was a typical energetic, happy little boy. He loved to ride his bike and play t-ball, collect hickory nuts, spiders and worms. He doted on his little brother, who he would read stories to, and was getting ready to start kindergarten at the Campbell Savona School in September 1993, less than a mile away on West Lamoka Avenue. Here, Ted and Tammy Smith lived with their children. 16-year-old Stacey and 13-year-old Eric were from Tammy's previous marriage, and we know that Ted had definitely adopted Eric and possibly Stacey as well. Completing the family was Ted and Tammy's 12-year-old daughter, Holly. Ted worked at the Phillips Lighting Company manufacturing plant in nearby Bath, and Tammy looked after the family and coached the girls' softball league in which her 2 daughters played. On the morning of the 2nd of August 1993, the 2 families' lives would change and become inextricably linked forever. During the school break, Savona Village Park held a day camp which many of the local children attended. In this small community, children would often walk to the camp in groups without adult supervision. The park was around 350 metres from Dale and Doreen's house. It was along a straight road with no crossings. 4-year-old Derek, who was fiercely independent, liked to walk to the camp on his own. His mother, Doreen, would watch from their home, checking to see that he met up with the group of children who were also headed to the day camp at the park. On the morning of Monday the 2nd of August 1993, Derek was keen to get to summer camp, but his younger brother, Dalton, was fussing. Doreen watched as he headed off on his walk, but returned inside to take care of her younger son. Thunderstorms had been forecast for that day, so less children were attending, and Derek made the last part of his journey alone and unsupervised. He was a bright boy who knew he had to stay on the pavement and had learnt that he should never talk to or go off with strangers. At 9:15 a.m, a local man, Bill Horn, drove past and waved at the young boy. Shortly after that, 13-year-old Eric cycled up to Derek and began talking to him. Eric said to Derek that they should go into the nearby wooded area as it was a shortcut to the park. Although Eric was not a complete stranger to Derek, they went to the same summer camp and would have seen each other out and about around the village. The little boy refused. Eric kept asking, but Derek continued to refuse until Eric told him that going through the woods was a shortcut and that they would beat everyone else to the camp. At that particular point, Derek agreed to go through the woods. At 9:30 a.m, Eric arrived at the park alone. Around an hour later, a thunderstorm struck in the area and the summer camp was cancelled for the day. When Doreen arrived to collect Derek, she was informed that he had not arrived that day. By 11:04 a.m, Derek was reported missing. The state police were called and local people came out in droves to help look for young Derek. At 3:45 p.m. came the devastating news that Derek's body had been found in a lightly wooded area just off of McCoy Street, in between the village park and his home. He had been strangled and beaten to death. Security in the small community was shattered. Initial reports stated that the police were looking for a suspicious person seen in a green pickup truck in the village, and that they were also looking into similarities between Derek's murder and the case of Jimmy Bernardo, a 12-year-old boy who had been abducted from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and killed 3 years earlier. Residents were scared. Children were no longer allowed out to play, and the community was devastated by the senseless loss of this beautiful young boy. By the 5th of August, 40 full-time investigators had been brought in to work on the case, but the police did not have any suspects. Campbell Savona Elementary School, where Derek was due to start in kindergarten the following month, announced that the baseball field would be named in his memory. Derek was laid to rest on the 7th of August. Around 700 people waited in line to pay their respects to the young boy. By this time, the police had announced that they believed the killer was a local person. 6 days after Derek's murder, 13-year-old Eric's great-grandfather, who was a retired sheriff, noticed some discrepancies in Eric's story about the day of the murder and realised that Eric was involved. He took his great-grandson to the district attorney's office in Bath, where Eric told the police that he had killed Derek. During his confession, Eric said that he was riding along McCoy Street on his bicycle, heading towards the summer camp in the park. He saw Derek walking to that same camp and stopped to talk to him. Eric said that he told Derek that he knew a shortcut through the woods, but Derek refused to go with him, saying that he was not allowed to go with strangers. Eric asked again, and Derek refused a second time. But when Eric said that they would beat everyone else to camp that morning, Derek finally agreed to go. Once they were in the woods, Eric admitted that he had choked the younger boy before hitting him in the head multiple times with a small rock. He then dropped a larger rock, later established to weigh 26 pounds, which is almost 12 kilos, onto Derek's head, smashing in his skull. Eric continued to throw rocks onto Derek's chest before opening the lunch that Doreen had prepared for her son and stuffing a napkin into Derek's mouth and then pouring Kool-Aid over his head and into the wounds.
The right part area where he had hit him with his rocks all these times, he said 3, hit him in the head and there was some blood there. He took the Kool-Aid and he did his hands like this, he said. So he took the Kool-Aid and I poured it into those cuts. Those are his words. I poured it into the cuts. I said, what forever did you do that for? I don't know, I just did.
Finally, Eric broke a twig from a tree and sodomized Derek's lifeless body. Once finished, Eric had got back onto his bike and headed towards the recreation program, but then decided to return a few minutes later to check that Derek was definitely dead. Eric then went and joined the summer camp, arriving at around 9:30 a.m. After this confession, Eric was charged with second-degree murder, which was the only capital crime for which a 13-year-old could be tried as an adult. As a consequence, he was then held at the Monroe County Children's Center. He appeared in court the following day and showed little emotion as he sat quietly and confirmed that he understood the charges against him. He was refused bail. As news of the arrest spread, 2 very different pictures of Eric began to emerge. Some news reports described a young boy who enjoyed spending time with his grandparents, loved riding his bike, fishing, and also playing the drums. He was outgoing and polite, a fair student who was a bit mischievous at times. He would sometimes get into trouble at school, but nothing that was particularly serious. However, other reports described a young boy with a bad temper who was quick to fight and that something about him just wasn't right. He would often struggle to make friends and would hang around with younger kids. Was he a bully or a victim of bullying? A show-off or a withdrawn loner? The answer would vary depending upon who was being interviewed. On the 5th of September, a memorial concert was held in honour of Derek to celebrate his life and raise money to cover his funeral expenses and to help his family move home. The concert raised over $25,000, with the additional money going towards a college fund for Derek's younger brother, Dalton. On the same day as this concert, Eric was indicted on a second-degree murder charge, and it was confirmed that he would be tried as an adult. In a 3-minute court appearance on the 10th of September, he pled not guilty. Eric underwent significant medical testing from specialists for both the prosecution and the defence, and it was decided that he was mentally competent to stand trial. His defence lawyer attempted to get the trial moved to family court, where Eric would receive a much lighter sentence if convicted, and the lawyer also attempted to get Eric's confession suppressed on the basis that Eric was never told that he would be prosecuted, only that he would get psychiatric help. Both of these attempts were unsuccessful. Due to the physical evidence and Eric's confession, the only defence available was not guilty by reason of insanity. The case eventually went to trial on the 26th of July 1994. The issue that the 6 men and 6 women of the jury needed to decide upon was not whether or not Eric had killed Derek, but his state of mind at the time of the killing. Eric sat in court looking small and vulnerable, wearing a Bugs Bunny t-shirt, looking far younger than his 14 years. The prosecution stated that there was nothing in Eric's brain function or hormone tests that explained his violent behaviour. They argued that the fact that Eric had asked Derek to accompany him into the woods multiple times demonstrated that he was in control of himself and not in an uncontrollable violent rage. They backed this up further by stating that because Eric went back to check that Derek was dead, it showed that he was aware of what he had done. Derek's family wholeheartedly rejected the defence that Eric could not control or be responsible for his actions. Although a motive was never clearly established, it was suggested that Eric's actions may have been driven by Derek having everything in life that he himself would want. The defence provided testimony from a psychiatrist stating that they had diagnosed Eric with intermittent explosive disorder. This is a behavioural disorder that is characterised by uncontrollable explosive outbursts of anger and violence, with 3 of the main indicators being bedwetting, fire setting, and cruelty to animals.
Eric Smith suffers from a mental disease that can be characterized as a rage disorder. He builds up inside himself, from whatever sources produce anger, he builds up rage. And it doesn't express itself, and then the rage explodes.
The defence said that Eric had a sadistic side which was beyond his control, which they believe was due to developmental abnormalities brought on by trimethadione, which was a drug that his mother took for epilepsy whilst pregnant.
It is by far and away the most toxic drug for a pregnant woman to be on. It can cause major congenital malformations. There are a variety of minor anomalies, which are things like low-set ears, widely spaced eyes, which are more minor and cosmetic. And then there are neurologic problems like mental retardation, learning disorders that can range in severity, but are also relatively common.
They stated that the crime was not premeditated and was as a result of pathological rage caused by mental illness. Testimony from many of those close to Eric painted a distressing picture of his life, but would this ultimately lead to him being found not guilty by reason of insanity? Eric's stepfather, Ted Smith, testified about an incident where Eric had come to him for help the previous spring, stating that after repeated arguments with his older sister, he felt like he was going to hurt someone. Ted said that he suggested to Eric that he use a punching bag to let out his aggression. Eric later returned and said that he had taken care of it. He had been repeatedly punching a tree until his knuckles were bloody. Eric's parents would also testify that Eric had been bullied at school for his red hair, glasses, and learning difficulties. He had a speech problem that would cause him to slur and spit, and he would become incredibly frustrated when people didn't understand him. It was also further disclosed that Eric had learnt that Ted wasn't his biological father at the age of 9 through taunting from his classmates. There was further tension in the family caused by the fact that his older sister was showered with gifts from their grandparents on their biological father's side of the family, whilst the same grandparents refused to even acknowledge Eric's existence. Eric was often sick and withdrawn and continued to wet the bed until he was 11 years old. Then, more disturbing details of Eric's past behaviour came to light. At the age of 3, he had got up in the middle of the night and set fire to a pile of paperwork in the kitchen. He had become obsessed with fire. In 1989, at the age of 9, Eric had strangled a neighbour's cat with a garden hose because he found the cat bothersome. His stepfather admitted to having a temper and sometimes hitting Eric, And the picture of a disturbing home life was further supported by Eric's older sister, Stacy. Stacy, who was only 16, had moved out of the family home in June 1993 and described her life there as hell. She said that the children were always being yelled at and there was a significant amount of both verbal and physical abuse. A psychiatrist for the defence stated that Stacy had said that her stepfather had sexually touched her twice, after which she became depressed and took an overdose. She had filed charges at the time, but later, at the apparent insistence of her mother, she then told social workers that she had lied. She then went on to describe Eric as the most caring member of the family. After listening to all the evidence, the jury retired and deliberated for around 8 hours before returning their verdict. At 9:44 p.m. on the 16th of August 1994, they found Eric guilty of second-degree murder. On the 7th of November, he was given the maximum sentence for his crime, which was from 9 years to life in prison. He showed no emotion during the reading of the sentence in Steuben County Court. Whilst in jail, he read an apology letter to Derek's family on television in which he stated, "I know my actions have caused a terrible loss in the Roby family, and for that I am truly sorry. I've tried to think as much as possible about what Derek will never experience. His 16th birthday, Christmas, any time, owning his own house, graduating, going to college, getting married, his first child. If I could go back in time, I would switch places with Derek and endure all the pain that I've caused him. If it meant that he would go on living, I'd switch places, but I can't." On the 5th of November 1994, a statue honouring Derek's short life was unveiled at Savona Village Park. Derek's great-uncle, Steve Huey, sculpted the clay figure, which was then bronzed by students at Alfred University. Eric spent several years in a juvenile facility before being moved to a maximum security adult prison. There were various infractions during his time here, including disobeying a direct order, smoking, and kissing another inmate. He was consistently denied parole every 2 years. From 2005 onwards, Eric maintained a clean prison disciplinary record, and in his 2012 parole hearing, he stated that he had not appreciated the impact of his actions at the time, and that he had shut down emotionally due to his own bullying and abuse. He said that he had selected his victim knowing that Derek was vulnerable and that he could overpower him. He went on to state that he had been working through his issues on a therapeutic program inside the prison and truly believed that this had helped him. He was, however, again denied parole after the board cited a concern for public safety if he were released. By 2020, he had been refused parole on 10 separate occasions. This was to change at his 11th hearing in October 2021, when he was granted parole and, after his release was delayed due to him not having an approved residence to go to, he became a free man on the 1st of February 2022 at the age of 41. He had served 27 years in prison for his crime. If he was still alive today, Derek would be 33 years old. His headstone reads, "In our hearts, you will remain forever young." My heart goes out to Derek and his family for this truly shocking crime. Rest in peace, Derek. Psst. The plaque on the memorial statue at Savona Village Park is inscribed with the words, "Dedicated to a gentle reminder of what childhood is meant to be." Goodbye. Today on the Crime Reel, we shall be visiting the American states of Nebraska and Wyoming to look at the shocking crimes of Charles Starkweather and his accomplice, or possible hostage, Caril and Fugate. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born in Lincoln, Nebraska on the 24th of November 1938 to Guy and Heather Starkweather. Guy Starkweather was a carpenter by trade who suffered from rheumatoid arthritis, which often left him unable to work, whilst his wife Heather was a waitress. Even though the family did not really have any money, they worked hard and provided for their 7 children as well as they could. All 7 of the Starkweather children were generally seen as being well behaved by their friends and neighbours and appeared to have a good, solid upbringing. Although Charles had a positive family life, he had a more difficult time at school. He had been born with a condition known as bow-leggedness and also had a minor speech impediment which led him to being constantly teased by his classmates. Unknown at the time, Charles was extremely short-sighted, which impacted his ability to learn in school. Despite being relatively bright, he never applied himself at school, which led to him being labelled a slow learner. During his time in Irving Middle School and subsequently Lincoln High School, he found that the one thing he excelled at was gym. He trained hard and was well coordinated and strong. However, he used this positive change in his life and his newfound physical strength to intimidate and fight those who had once bullied him. It wasn't long before his aggression was directed to anyone he disliked, or that he felt was in some way better than him, better looking, better dressed, and pretty soon his reputation as a well-behaved teenager had turned into notoriety for being one of the meanest and toughest kids in Lincoln. In his early teens, Charles had a fight with another young man by the name of Bob von Busch, and after resolving their differences, they became close friends. Bob was quoted as saying that Charles would be one of the kindest people you've ever seen if he liked you, and one of the meanest if he did not. Both Charles and Bob became obsessed with James Dean, with Charles soon trying to mimic all of his hero's mannerisms. Charles looked up to the on-screen persona portrayed by James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, feeling that he could relate to the troubled character. He dropped out of school at the age of 16 and started to work in a local newspaper warehouse, where he soon became disillusioned with the monotony and poverty of his life. Caril Ann Fugate was 5 years younger than Charles. Born on the 30th of July 1943, also in Lincoln, Nebraska. She was the second daughter of William and Velda Fugate. Her sister Barbara was 3 when she was born. Their dad, William, was a drunk who neglected and both verbally and physically abused his family, leaving them to live a life of unnecessary poverty. Caril and Barbara would often return home from school to find the house packed up and their mother preparing to move, as once again William had squandered all of their rent money on drink. While constantly changing schools, Caril and Barbara found it difficult to make friends and relied heavily on each other. When Caril was 8, her and Barbara witnessed a particularly violent argument between their parents, during which William had his hand squeezed around Velda's throat and the children had to come to her rescue. This was the final straw for Velda, and she left William, taking the children with her. In 1954, Velda went on to marry an older man by the name of Marion Bartlett. Marion was a strict but kind man who raised the girls as if they were his own. In 1956, Velda and Marion welcomed another daughter by the name of Betty Jean. Both Caril and Barbara were smitten with their new baby sister. Meanwhile, their father, William, remarried, received convictions for drunken behaviour and also being a peeping Tom before dying in prison in 1958. Caril grew into a confident, rebellious teen, often testing her mother and stepfather with her feisty nature. By the age of 13, she was inclined to dress in heavy boots, jeans, and a man's shirt, rather than the more feminine styles favoured in 1950s America. Although only 5 foot 1 inch tall, with her bold attitude, wild streak, and short temper, she often passed as being much older. Similar to Charles, she also didn't do well at school, again being labelled as a slow learner. She had limited experience of life beyond the confines of her world in Lincoln, Nebraska. By 1956, Charles' best friend Bob had begun dating Caril's older sister Barbara. Sometime during the summer of that year, when Caril was just 13 years old, Bob and Barbara and Charles and Caril went on a double date to a local drive-in movie. Caril and Charles hit it off immediately. She was infatuated with his James Dean persona, whilst he was obsessed with her rebellious, no-nonsense personality. They soon became engrossed in their own world. excluding those around them. Charles decided to leave his job at the warehouse and began working full-time as a garbage collector. Even though he earned very little, his shifts enabled him to meet Caril from school each day. Velda and Marion were completely against this relationship, believing that Charles was a bad influence on Caril, but no matter how hard they tried, they could not prevent the two youngsters from seeing each other. About a year after they had met, Caril had a small accident in Charles's father's car. This then resulted in a huge argument between Charles and his father, Guy. This became physical, with Guy hitting his son so hard that he flew through a window. At this point, Charles left home, and after temporarily moving in with the newly married Bob and Barbara, he ended up living in a rented room in the same apartment block. Charles continued to treat Caril like a princess, showering her with attention, compliments and gifts. However, this lifestyle was difficult to maintain on his meagre wages. He soon fell behind with his rent and had no money with which to take Caril out or buy her gifts. So he had a plan. He began to look for other ways to supplement his income. On the 30th of November 1957, Charles went to the local gas station where he tried to buy a toy dog for Caril. A new attendant by the name of Robert Colvert refused to let Charles buy the dog on credit. In the early hours of 1st of December, 21-year-old Robert Colvert was working at the gas station by himself when Charles came in to buy cigarettes. Charles left and then returned later, this time buying chewing gum. He subsequently returned a third time wearing a red bandana and hat while brandishing a shotgun. Charles handed Robert a cash bag, asking him to fill it from the till, a total of $108. He then insisted that Robert open the safe, but the new employee did not have the safe code, so was genuinely unable to do so. At this point, a raging and frustrated Charles bundled Robert into the front of his car, drove him to a dirt road just outside of Lincoln, where he shot him in the head. Robert died immediately, leaving behind his wife, who 5 months later gave birth to their baby daughter. Charles later described how he had felt nervous before the robbery. However, his nerves diminished once he was in control of the situation, and later, once he pulled the trigger, he felt a sense of calm wash over him, believing he was now above the law and untouchable. Later that day he went to meet Caril and he told her about the robbery. This is where reports start to vary. Some state that he told Caril about the murder, and the fact that she did not end their relationship meant that Charles assumed that they were now in it together. However, others describe Charles as telling Caril about the robbery and blaming the shooting on an unnamed accomplice. Again, reports vary as to whether or not she believed this version of events. Obviously, the murder and robbery became a major news event in the low crime area of Lincoln, Nebraska. Charles used some of the money to respray his car to avoid detection. He paid up his owed rent and bought himself some second-hand clothes. He paid for these clothes using loose change, something which made the store owner suspicious, as it was widely reported that the majority of the money stolen in the robbery was coins. The owner reported it to the police, but no effort was made to investigate Charles any further. Having got away with murder, Charles became increasingly confident, believing that for once he was in control and would be able to afford things like the people whose garbage he used to collect. However, the money from the robbery did not last long, and soon Charles was facing the reality of his life again. He had no job, no money, no means to pay his rent, and limited contact with his family. On January the 21st, 1958, Charles went to visit Caril at her home. Caril was not in at the time, but her mother Velda and stepfather Marion were. As Caril's parents were completely against Charles and Caril's relationship, and according to some reports had witnessed an argument 2 days earlier where Caril ended things with Charles, they turned him away and told him to stay away from their daughter. Charles had his shotgun with him under the pretense of asking Marion to go shooting with him in the hope of improving their relationship. However, when he found he was not welcome at the house, he shot Velda in the face and Marion in the back of the head. 2-year-old Betty Jean was crying in her crib, and in order to silence her, Charles stabbed her to death. He then moved the bodies, leaving Velda inside the commode in the family's outhouse, Betty Jean in a box of garbage, and Marion was left on the floor of the chicken coop. Again, reports vary wildly as to exactly what happened during these murders. There seem to be 4 different versions of events, depending on who is asked and the source of the information. 1. Charles claimed that Caril was present at the house and helped him with both the murders and subsequent clean-up. 2. Caril claimed that she had returned home from school to find Charles threatening her with a gun, her family gone, and she became his hostage. 3. Some reports state that when she arrived back from school to find her family missing and Charles in her house with a gun, she still became a willing accomplice from that point onwards. And 4. While others report that she returned home to find that her parents and baby sister had been murdered, and she willingly assisted Charles with cleaning up the bodies and mess. Whether or not Caril knew that her family were dead, or whether she was there at her own free will or being held as a hostage, one thing that is known for certain is that Charles and Caril spent the next 6 days living in her parents' house. Charles went to a payphone and called Marion's employers to inform them that he was ill and would not be at work for a few days. Caril taped a handwritten note to the front door asking people to stay away as they were all sick with the flu. They survived on bread and milk, bought on credit from the milkman, and a few other essentials, which Charles visited the nearby grocery store to buy. This later led to some people questioning whether 14-year-old Caril was truly a hostage, as surely this would have given her the time to escape. Eventually, friends and family became suspicious of the excuses. Again, reports vary. Did Caril turn everyone away using the excuse of the flu, or has been separately reported, did she warn people to leave believing her family's lives were in danger? Marion's boss, Caril's grandmother, and Bob von Busch all reported their concerns to the police. When the police eventually went to investigate the property, they found the bodies of Velda, Marion, and baby Betty Jean. But Charles and Caril were already on the run. A police bulletin was immediately issued for their arrest, but few could have predicted the events that would follow. Aware that the police would soon be looking for them, Charles knew that they had to find a different car to make their escape. He decided to find refuge at the house of August Mayer, an elderly family friend. August was a bachelor who lived on a farm in a remote location approximately 20 miles outside of Lincoln. August had known Charles since he was a young boy, but upon their arrival at the farm, Charles fatally shot August in the head. August's body was carried into an outhouse and hidden with a blanket. Charles and Caril then stole August's money and guns and tried to make their escape. As they drove away down a muddy path, they got their car stuck and resorted to leaving on foot. Hiding their guns, they managed to hitch a ride from 2 local teenagers, 17-year-old Robert Jensen and his girlfriend, Caril King. Almost immediately, Charles pulled a gun on the young couple and forced them to drive back to an abandoned storm cellar near August's farm. Once in the storm cellar, Robert was shot multiple times in the head. Caril was shot once in the head and had been stabbed repeatedly. Again, there is ambiguity over who was actually responsible for these killings. Charles later confessed to the murder of Robert, but said that Caril killed Caril King in a jealous rage. Some sources state that Caril was left in the car whilst Charles carried out these murders by himself. Charles and Caril then fled in Robert Jensen's car and for some unknown reason decided to return to Lincoln, even driving past Caril's home to see if the bodies of her family had been discovered. They headed on to a more affluent area of the town, where they approached the house of C. Lauer Ward, a successful 47-year-old businessman. In the house were his 46-year-old wife Clara, 51-year-old maid Lillian Fenchy, and the family's 2 dogs, Queenie and Susie. Then there was a knock at the front door. The maid, Lillian, opened the door to be greeted by Charles pointing a shotgun directly at her face before forcing his way into the home. Charles then proceeded to have both the maid and Clara make food for him in order to assert power over one of the richest families in the area for whom he had previously collected trash. Both Clara and Lillian were then stabbed multiple times and left to die. Susie, the family's small poodle, also had her neck snapped. Again, whether these murders were committed by Charles or Caril, we will never truly know, as they would later blame each other. Whilst at Lauer's house, Charles called his father, asking him to inform Bob von Busch that he was going to kill him because he had dared to interfere with his relationship with Caril. Charles also wrote a rambling letter which was addressed to the law only, which attempted to justify his crimes. When Lauer returned from work that evening, he was shot dead by Charles. The couple then ransacked the house, taking anything of any use or value to them, and packed it into Lauer's black 1956 Packard, ready to make their escape. Around 5:30 p.m. that evening, the Lincoln Journal was delivered to the house. Charles and Caril were on the front page. Charles became incredibly excited as he felt that he was now famous and someone to be reckoned with. The following morning, Lauer's cousin was concerned when Lauer did not arrive at work, so he went to check on the family, only to stumble upon this grisly murder scene. The National Guard and local police were brought in to help with the manhunt. The city was sealed off and searched block by block. A $1,000 reward was offered. An aircraft was sent in to look for the black Packard, but without success. Charles and Caril had been driving all night, arriving in Wyoming early on the 29th of January 1958. They decided that they needed to change cars again and came across a man by the name of Merle Collison, who was sleeping in his Buick at the side of the highway. Merle was a 37-year-old travelling salesman and a World War II veteran from Montana. The couple woke Merle and proceeded to shoot him multiple times in the head, neck, arm and leg, killing him immediately. Again, Charles and Caril both stated that the other one had pulled the trigger. With Merle dead in the front passenger seat and Caril in the back, Charles attempted to drive away, only to find that he was unable to release the emergency brake. A passing motorist, assuming that they had car trouble, stopped to help. Charles pulled the gun on the unsuspecting motorist, demanding that he help release the brake if he wanted to live. Seeing Merle in the front seat, the motorist realised that his only chance was to get the gun away from Charles, and a struggle followed. As the struggle continued, by pure good luck, a Wyoming deputy sheriff by the name of William Romer arrived at the scene. Caril ran from Merle's car to the sheriff, shouting that the person in the car was Charles Starkweather and that he was going to kill her. By this time, Charles had returned to the Packard and was speeding back towards the town of Douglas. Deputy Sheriff Romer immediately ordered a roadblock, providing details of Charles and the Packard. Douglas Police Chief Robert Ainsley and Sheriff Earl Heflin of Converse County, Wyoming, were in their car when Charles sped past. A high-speed chase followed, during which Sheriff Heflin shot out the back windscreen of Charles's car. Suddenly, Charles came to a complete stop in the middle of the highway. The two lawmen cautiously approached the vehicle and Charles surrendered, believing that he had been shot and was bleeding to death. In actuality, he had a cut on his ear caused by the glass from the back windshield. Both Charles and Caril were arrested that day in Wyoming. They were sent back to Nebraska to face trial. Charles requested that the trial was held in Nebraska rather than Wyoming, as he assumed he would face the death penalty either way and would prefer the electric chair in Nebraska rather than the gas chamber in Wyoming. What he failed to realise was that Millward Simpson, the then governor of Wyoming, was opposed to the death penalty, and had Charles been tried there, he would have most likely received a life sentence instead. Caril became the youngest US woman ever to be tried for first-degree murder. At the ages of 19 and 14, both Charles and Caril were tried as adults, and as such both faced a potential death penalty. Caril continued to protest her innocence, stating that she was a hostage who stayed with Charles, as he had threatened to kill her entire family if she didn't. Initially, Charles told the authorities that Caril had nothing to do with the crimes, but as time went on and he realised that she was portraying herself as a hostage rather than his girlfriend, he began to blame her for a number of the murders. He confessed to the murders of Robert Colvert, Velda Bartlett, Marion Bartlett, Betty Jean Bartlett, August Mayer, Robert Jensen and C. Lower Ward, but stated that Caril was responsible for the murders of Caril King, Clara Ward, Lillian Fenchy and Merle Collison. Charles' lawyers prepared a defence that he was innocent by reason of insanity, a claim that was rejected by the jury when he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Caril's trial strategy was that she was a hostage forced by Charles to go along on his killing spree for fear of what would happen if she did not. The judge did not believe this story, as there had been many opportunities for her to escape. The jury agreed with the judge, and in November 1958, she was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Charles Starkweather was executed in the electric chair at Nebraska State Penitentiary on June 25, 1959. He was 20 years old. He is buried in the same cemetery in Lincoln as 5 of his victims. Caril's sentence was commuted, which allowed her to be paroled in June 1976 after serving 18 years in the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women. Upon her release, she changed her name and moved to Lansing, Michigan. She married in 2007 and was seriously injured in a car crash in 2013, which took the life of her husband. To this day, Caril maintains her innocence and has never been arrested since her release in 1976, which leads us to the question, was she a spree killer who has rehabilitated within the prison system, or an innocent victim who lost 18 years of her life in prison, becoming the final victim of Charles Starkweather? Did you know singer-songwriter Billy Joel, in his 1989 music single We Didn't Start the Fire, makes reference to the Starkweather homicide in the lyrics of that song? Goodbye.